A wise man once said, if you no longer go for a gap that exists, you are no longer a racing driver. Sadly, at the moment those words came out of that wise man's mouth, he was using them to justify what must surely be the worst example in F1 history of crashing into another driver on purpose. Of course, I'm talking about Ayrton Senna and his flawed attempt to justify wiping out his nemesis Alain Prost at the start of the 1990 Japanese Grand Prix, a race we are finally covering on Bring Back V10s after years of being asked to. I'm Glenn Freeman, and joining me to go back over Senna's day of shame and much, much more from late 1990, we have Edd Straw and Andrew Vanderberg. Andy, welcome to your first appearance of season 12. Straightforward question with what I assume is going to be a straightforward answer. When you think of Suzuka 90, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
And it's happened immediately.
It's too easy. Ed, any advances on that?
Well, I sort of compartmentalised the infamous collisions sort of together, that and the previous years. So actually, Suzuka 90 always makes me think of the best podium ever. What a story! Every single one of those three drivers, a mega story, which we'll get onto. But yeah, it is, I think, potentially my favourite F1 podium.
That's because there's a LaRousse on it, isn't it?
Well, that's a big part of it, yeah.
Right, we're going to start with a story that will eventually relate to that podium, because the big story heading into Suzuka was the terrible news about Benetton driver Alessandro Nannini, who had the lower part of his right arm severed in a helicopter accident. Nannini has said in interviews that he remembers everything about the accident, which happened just outside his parents' house, where the pilot tried to land on uneven ground and the tail rotor hit the ground. The pilot's attempts to get the helicopter back up off the ground failed, and when recalling the incident to Motorsport magazine in 2015, Nannini said, "I put my hands up to protect my head. I thought we would turn over when we went down, but the rotor blade hit my arms and I was thrown out. It all happened so fast, just a few seconds, but my right arm was gone." He said his dad retrieved his arm and gave it to the ambulance crew that arrived on the scene, although Nannini says they didn't want to take the arm to the hospital. He fell unconscious on the way to the hospital and woke up 2 days later with the arm reattached, and said while it was a shock, he didn't think it would be the end of his career, because in his words, a racer drives with his arse. The hands are not so important. Speaking to Auto Week in 2016, Nannini said the worst part of his rehabilitation was learning to smoke with his left hand. But on a more serious note, he said he considered himself lucky because 95% of people involved in accidents similar to mine die. He said, maybe I could have been world champion one day if things had worked out differently, but he prefers to focus on what I have rather than what I didn't have. Andy, what do you think about that latest claim there? Could a world championship have been in Nannini's future without this accident?
So as I mentioned pre-recording, I watched the whole of this race back from the Brazilian TV feed. And they had something I hadn't seen before. And on the grid, PK had a live call to Nannini in hospital. And looking at the timeline, he can't have long been out of theatre. And there he was, speaking to him on the TV with a radio from the car. It was amazing that they did that, and amazing that Nannini was sort of awake enough to be able to take the call, given that what he'd gone through. I guess the thing is in the question when he says world champion, does he mean F1 world champion? Because categorically not, although I could have seen how he may have been FIA GT champion or something like that, given the amazing career that he went on to have, despite really driving with one arm. I mean, his heroics in the DTM and with Mercedes in those amazing GT1 cars, nothing sort of amazing. I like Nannini. When he was in the Minardi and was sort of throwing that thing around, I thought maybe he might have been something special. I think he put it 13th on the grid in Monaco, which is way beyond where it should have been. But I think we saw in his time next to Boutsen in Benetton that he was more or less on a par with him, and no one's saying that Thierry Boutsen should have been world champion, are they?
It's also one of those things with drivers, isn't it, that if they're, for whatever reason, denied the chance, then they sort of always retain potential world champion status, don't they? But I think I'd agree with Andy. Nannini, I don't think was quite in that calibre, although he was a very good driver. Probably at the time, though, I'd have said he was, perhaps underestimating what it takes to do that. I was
a race winner, I would say. If he'd got himself in a good car, he would have won a few.
I was very, very impressed because I got Nannini's autograph when he was racing in the DTM. And I remember in my younger days being very impressed he could sign the autograph with his reconstituted hand, which was kind of
Yeah.
had to be reconstituted so he could hold a steering wheel with it. So yeah, hugely impressive what he did in coming back. I'd agree with that. That's an amazing story in itself. A little bit like Robert Kubica, actually, one of those stories that is sort of more remarkable for not perhaps having the F1 career he should have done.
Yeah, that's a really good comparison. Naturally, this being F1, the wheels kept on turning, so immediately attention turned to who would replace Nannini a week later at the Japanese Grand Prix. Ford were interested in IndyCar racer Michael Andretti getting the opportunity, but he couldn't do Japan because it clashed with the IndyCar finale at Laguna Seca. Andrea De Cesaris and Martin Brundle were also supposedly in the mix, but one man who has confirmed he was offered the seat was Leighton House racer Ivan Capelli. Around 3 hours after Capelli saw a news report on TV about Nannini's accident, Benetton team boss Flavio Briatore called him to offer him the drive. Capelli said he wasn't sure he could take the offer as he'd already promised Leighton House owner Akira Akagi that he would stay with that team for 1991, so he said he would need to talk to him first. Briatore's response to that was, "So what's your decision?" And when Capelli said he couldn't give an answer yet, Briatore moved on to find an alternative. Capelli said years later that he couldn't go back on giving his word to Leighton House, even if, looking at history, it could have been completely different if he'd joined Benetton. Ed, how do you think Capelli would have got on at Benetton? I know you were an admirer of him, and not just because he sat in Leighton Houses a lot.
You know, it feels a little bit like the fork in the road, doesn't it? Because that would have been the ideal time to leave Leighton House, and it would have meant he wasn't at Ferrari. And it's really, really hard to reconstitute what could have been for Capelli if he hadn't had that Ferrari journey. Now, I think ultimately, I always say you've got to make the best of the opportunities you get, even if they're difficult. And I think that shows that, again, Capelli wasn't quite in the future world champion class that perhaps he looked like on his best days. But I think he could have done a very, very good job at Benetton. Whether it would have stuck longer term for him, who knows? Obviously, you're still just a year away from Schumacher coming onto the scene, and they presumably would still wanted him. But I think he would have been a good kind of plug in and play option. But it's to his credit, because Akagi had done so much for his career. I think it's to his credit that he wanted to do things the right way. So you could probably say, being completely ruthless, he should have just said yeah and then gone and sorted it out. I think it actually reflects very well on him that he did it the way that he did. But I'm sure he'd have got some very good results. Certainly more podiums, and I think Capelli had some wins in him, given the right opportunities.
While Benetton had been chasing other options then, another driver had, well, pretty much literally fallen into their lap. On the day of Nannini's accident, Roberto Moreno was calling round F1 teams in the UK about opportunities for 1991. One of those calls was to Benetton's John Barnard, who Moreno had worked with as a Ferrari test driver when Barnard was developing the semi-automatic paddle shift for 1989. Barnard said he needed a driver to sit in a wooden mock-up of the 1991 Benetton to check certain things in the cockpit were in the right place, which Moreno offered to do in exchange for a cup of tea and some chocolate biscuits. This was arranged before Nannini's accident, but by the afternoon, the news had come through and Barnard's phone was constantly ringing with people trying to get the drive. Barnard told Moreno what was going on, then said, "You came here to do us a favour before all this happened, so I want you to drive for us." Andy, do you think that without being on site that day, coincidentally, with Barnard, would Moreno have even been in the running for this drive? Would he have been a contender?
I mean, maybe. He had a very long-standing relationship with PK. I've got a Mike Dudson biography of PK's, and there's a picture of them karting with little Moreno with long curly hair, if you can
Wow.
imagine that. Although it's already receding, and he's like a young teenager. So it's potentially maybe through the link there, but it's hard to imagine it would have been off the back of what he'd done with EuroBrun that season. So I thought I'd go back and check. You know, he qualified 16th for Phoenix in the opening round and finished
Yeah.
the race.
Wasn't he
Um,
ahead of Mansell's for? Wasn't there, I'm sure there was somebody good behind him as well because they'd had problems in
Yeah,
Phoenix.
I mean, unbelievable. He next made it through pre-qualifying for Imola, and then but broke down on the opening lap, so no more laps there. And he actually made it through pre-qualifying in Mexico, but was given a push start infringement in qualifying. So even though he would have made the grid, he was disqualified, and that was the last time they got anywhere near making the cut. I think AGS and LaRusso got there act together, and EuroBrun's 3 seconds off the pace wasn't enough to make the cut anymore. So he was unlikely that he caught anybody's attention with those performances. So probably one of the more fortuitous hiring decisions ever. But fair play to him for getting on the phone.
He had done a little bit of straight line testing for them as well, so he was kind of established as Barnard's mate, wasn't he? So I suspect he was always going to be on the list, but that probably bumped him up somewhat when some of their other options, the options didn't come through. But I feel Moreno deserved a little bit of a slice of luck at some stage, didn't he? Because he didn't have a great deal of luck with the cars he drove in his F1 career, so it's nice he was able to jump into this car and at least get a few results on the board.
Yeah, and as Andy said there, a really good advert for put yourself out there. Keep yourself on the radar, and a chance might come up. We've just mentioned EuroBrun there. Moreno now had the small matter of making sure he was actually free to take the Benetton drive, which meant speaking to the EuroBrun team that, as Andy outlined so brilliantly there, had done very little in 1990. When Moreno tried to call team owner Walter Brun, he was told by Brun's secretary that the team wasn't going to take part in the final 2 races of the year, which Moreno asked to have faxed over so he had it in writing. In the end, the team agreed to send in writing in person via a liaison. And when that meeting happened, Moreno was told he needed to pay $30,000 to exit his contract. Moreno kicked the guy out of his car, angrily drove off, then realised he still had the guy's bag, so he reversed, threw the bag at him, and then angrily sped off again. He said the threat, though, from EuroBrun gave him a few sleepless nights, but Benetton were confident they could ignore it. Of course they were. Flavio Briatore was in charge. But Ed, what do you make of that little stunt from EuroBrun? They're basically done, but they're thinking, let's see if we can get 30 grand out of this guy before we shut the team down.
Yeah, well, I think it was probably out of necessity. They probably looked at Benetton and thought, well, there's a team that's got a few quid. They need a driver. They want him, so maybe we can get that out of them. I presume there were quite a lot of debts to be paid because this team had been limping on. So I don't see it really as something that was targeted at Moreno as such, and more just Brun seeing an opportunity to try and get a little bit of cash back from the one asset they did have under lock and key. So in the circumstances, I don't completely blame, because he might have been looking at and think, well, that's some cash we can pay to employees that we owe them, or to pay suppliers or whatever. So when you look at it in that world, you kind of think, well, okay, you can't entirely blame them for trying to do that, because probably 30,000 wouldn't have mattered a great deal to Briatore and Benetton at that point.
It's such an oddly specifically low number. It makes me think it's probably what they either owed Goodyear or Judd.
Yeah, it's probably one invoice, isn't it? One big invoice.
The one that's most likely to take them to court.
That's exactly what I was thinking. The one bill that is going to cause you the most trouble, try and clear that and then just hide from all the rest. Now, EuroBrun weren't the only no-hoper team that wasn't going to make it to the final 2 flyaway races of the year, as Life also decided to call time on its worthless existence. Sorry, Ed, if you take offence at that, but come on. This also brought the total entry for Suzuka down to 30 cars, so there wouldn't even be a pre-qualifying session. And for that, Ed, I am genuinely sorry.
I think we should just stop this now. It's just pointless.
Do you want to just walk off at this point? Life's driver, Bruno Giacomelli, said at the time that he wasn't sure what the future held for the team. I think the rest of us were. But he felt it was a shame because Life had a productive test at Vallelunga after the previous race at Jerez. In Jerez, he'd lapped 20 seconds off the pace of the AGS cars in pre-qualifying. But Life had recently switched to Judd engines for the previous 2 events, and Giacomelli said it was a pity they weren't continuing, as they'd managed 25 to 30 laps without problems in that recent test, and he was pretty sure we could have run reasonably well. Andy, is there any universe in which the Life could have run reasonably well if the team had carried on for the final 2 races of 1990?
It requires an infinite number of universe. The answer's still no. In the early 2000s, I tried to look it up, and I couldn't find any internet record of it. So I'm going to guess it was 2004. I went to a BMW thing at Silverstone where they had Ralf Schumacher in the F1 car, Andy Prio in the World Touring car. I can't remember who was driving the Formula BMW car, and a Z8. And they did one of those races where they set off at various intervals to show how quick an F1 car is. Anyway, Giacomelli was driving the Z8. And in hospitality, he was sitting on his own having lunch. And I thought, do you know what? I'm going to go up and talk to him. So I introduced myself and I sat down and we had lunch together. And I mean, I could have talked about driving Alfa Romeos and potentially, putting it on pole positions at Long Beach. Had pole in 80 or 81. Anyway, no, I want to talk about the life. So I know apparently it's claimed it had 450 horsepower. He told me it barely had more than 300.
We can say more than
And
three.
well, I mean, probably not as that. Absolute no hoper. And even with whatever it had, 300 and something horsepower, it was slower than an F3 car. So it wasn't like the chassis was inherently quick. The chassis was inherently awful. So you could have put any engine in that car and it would have been terrible. I mean, what's it, 20 seconds off the pace with the Judd? I mean, wow, brilliant. I think it's amazing they managed to adapt the car to put it in, but you have to wonder why. Apparently there were 9 people in the team. They included the team boss's wife. I mean, how are you expected to go F1 racing with that size of team? I mean, that is genuinely a Formula 3 operation doing F1. And I mean, I love the fact it's an oddity and it had a W12, but I think it is the single worst F1 car there's ever been.
Not even a good F3 operation doing F1. They turned
No.
up for their first race without very basic fundamental equipment of having to scrounge things off people. I've got things in my garage that they didn't seem to have for their first race. So that can,
Oh, was it? They
that
didn't have a
can
tyre pressure gauge or something like that?
yeah, also just the fundamentals. So it's yeah. I mean, I think reasonably well for life was just getting around a lap, wasn't it? But it's funny, isn't it? I talked earlier about that you have the thing that never happened was always going to be better than it was. So of course it's typical that with this team, we just had this great test where the car actually moved for a sequence of laps, which almost never happened. It's like, yeah, I'm sure it did.
I could tell when Andy was telling the Giacomelli story there, Ed was absolutely delighting in the fact that life was the thing you chose to talk to him about. And the Bring Back V10s audience, particularly those in the members club, will thank you for that as well. Now, as well as Nannini, who we talked about at the beginning, another badly injured driver on the sidelines was Martin Donnelly, who had had a horrible accident in qualifying last time out at Jerez and was still in a serious condition in hospital. That meant his Lotus team were also on the hunt for a replacement driver, and they offered an F1 return to Johnny Herbert, whose last F1 appearances had been a couple of stand-ins for Tyrrell in late 1989 after he'd been dropped mid-season by Benetton. Herbert said in his book that the F1 comeback made him realise how much he was missing it, but he didn't feel he was in the right place mentally, physically, and professionally to be capable of a full return yet. During the weekend, he said he needed more time to get back up to speed with an F1 car, especially on the brakes, and after retiring from the race with an engine problem, he said he felt he'd done okay and was just missing that little bit extra. Ed, were you pleased to see Herbert working his way back towards F1 with this little cameo?
Yeah, it's a great story, the Johnny Herbert story, isn't it? And I think even though it was probably right that he was benched after those early races in '89, he's definitely a driver that people were interested in, and he'd done a lot of work to actually be able to drive given the injuries he'd had. So yeah, it was very positive. And I think being able just to jump into a car and do a decent job was quite important at that point, because everyone will have just in F1 have seen him as the guy who did it a bit, but ultimately he wasn't fit enough, and that would probably have just been the story of him forever. But there was obviously some faith in him there, and that led to the full-time opportunity. So yeah, it's a really good feel-good story, and it's a good example of getting himself into a car and then doing a decent job, and then that is what leads to further opportunities down the line. So yeah, very positive in that regard, and yeah, just jumping in these couple of occasions, because he had a few kind of drop-in appearances in this period, made a very big difference and kept him on the map. And yeah, very, very good.
At Suzuka, the Brabham-Yamaha partnership for 1991 was officially revealed, with Martin Brundle already signed to return to the team as its lead driver. Brundle told Autosport's Adam Cooper that he'd had people asking if he was disappointed to miss out on Nannini's Benetton seat, and I'll quickly add here that even Moreno believes Benetton had Brundle on standby if Moreno couldn't solve his issues with EuroBrun. But Brundle said at the time that he hadn't been eyeing that drive, and he was happy with his Brabham deal because he was clear number one in the team, and I know we can do a good job. Andy, should we believe what Brundle said at the time about missing out on that Benetton opportunity?
I'm just about willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. But there was no way in which he could have thought that the Brabham deal was better than what was on there from Benetton. Maybe it was the fact that it was a full season backing F1. And of course, when he'd been there at 89, the Brabham thing had been quite good, right? Obviously,
That's
the
true.
Monaco, what could have, should have been. Um, I don't think there was any grounds for optimism about the Yamaha deal, though. I know it's different to the engine that Zaxby'd have had, where did they actually even make a race with it? Maybe one in the previous season. And he would have known about all of the ownership dilemmas between Middlebridge and Landhurst and whatever was going on there. And I'd be surprised if he'd been assured that there was a proper budget there, because I don't recall there ever being a serious sponsor on the side of that car. But fair play to him for at least having the loyalty to stick by the contract that he'd signed, although everything else tells you that he should have tried to get the Benetton opportunity.
I think he was sold on the fact there was a lot more money there than there actually was. So I suspect that's part of the problem here.
I guess to be fair to Martin, I remember we've done Phoenix 91, which was the first round of the next season, and we had a Brabham segment in there, I think, where they were hailing all the Japanese sponsors they brought in because of the Yamaha tie-up. So I guess at this point, Martin's being told, Yamaha have come back, they're a bit more serious this time. There's going to be lots of money. You've got a contract. I can at least see why in public as well you would talk that up and toe the party line. So yeah, maybe that was the case. But as for Yamaha, which was returning after, as we briefly mentioned, a disastrous 1989 with Zaxbyed, Yamaha senior managing director Takahiko Hasegawa talked of building a Brabham-Yamaha dynasty and promised that they would work steadily and relentlessly towards achieving a common goal. And Brundle added, Yamaha are doing all the right things for all the right reasons. A work-supported V12 engine with Japanese technology can't be too far wrong. Ed, picking up on the Yamaha comments there, was there anything steady and relentless about its F1 program over all the years that followed, not just the Brabham bit?
Yeah, probably steady in performance and relentlessly mediocre, being generous.
Very
So
good.
yeah, that,
Mediocre is generous.
very generous. Yeah, particularly in this phase. Ultimately, yeah, I mean, Brundle referenced the fact that it was a works engine and Japanese engine know-how, etc. The mythical Japanese engine know-how that's sometimes invoked. They have great success as well in that country in Formula One, but I think people just naturally assumed that they'd all be brilliant. But yeah, Yamaha wasn't. Gary Anderson, who ran the Yamaha engine in '92, and the Jordans got some good stories. And yeah, it wasn't really until they got involved with John Judd a few years later that they started to make some tangible progress with it. So yeah, they were just very underpowered for Formula One, let's put it that way, literally, in terms of the actual performance and also just the design know-how, etc. Because Yamaha was kind of a very much a fringe company in many ways. It's an odd one to have got into Formula One in the first place. So yeah, remarkable they were around for so long. But yeah, I think there was just this assumption they'd become really good, and yeah, that they didn't.
Yeah, I feel like they sort of didn't. They were doing an inoffensive job by the time the Tyrrell thing came along. But when Damon Hill was in a Yamaha powered Arrows, there was plenty of talk about how underpowered and rubbish it was. So yeah, it never quite got there. Let's get on to the race weekend then and look at the grid for the race, as Ayrton Senna took pole position from 2/10 ahead of Ferrari's Alain Prost for a race where Senna could be crowned champion for the second time, as he came into the weekend 9 points ahead of Prost with just 18 remaining. But Senna wasn't completely overjoyed to be on pole, as he'd been asking all weekend for officials to move pole position to the outside of the track so it'd be on the cleaner racing line. Senna said he had been told pole would be moved before qualifying, and then afterwards it was decided to leave it where it was. McLaren boss Ron Dennis called this a manipulation of the World Championship, and Senna said you break your balls to be on pole and then they put you on the wrong side of the circuit to the benefit of whoever is in second place. McLaren team manager Joe Ramirez said Prost was aware of Senna's request and wasn't bothered by it, but Senna said a year later in an explosive press conference performance that we will come back to later on, Senna said that FISA president, so the FIA sporting arm back then, Jean-Marie Balestre, gave an order to leave pole position on the inside. And he will come back to this pivotal moment in the weekend as we unravel everything else that we know is about to happen. But regardless of who made the call, was Senna within his rights to be annoyed about pole being on the dirty side of the track?
I think one of the brilliant thing the Senna movie does is show how highly charged the atmosphere was around this time, how the conspiracies were flowing, the paranoia was in place, how tigers were being seen in all of the trees. and I feel this fits in completely. I had a little look, but I couldn't find any complaints of him saying pole was on the wrong side when he started there in 88 or 89, but he was beaten off the line by Prost on both occasions, although one of them was a jump start. Um, so I can see why that might be playing on his mind as well. I think it just fits in with tonally and narratively everything else that was going on there at the time, and the feeling that, you know, he wasn't just fighting Prost on track, he was fighting him in the management of the series as well. So I mean, do I think he's got a fair point? Yeah, I mean, he's definitely right to be annoyed if he feels all these things are literally conspiring against him.
Pole was eventually moved down the line to the Suzuka. They start on that side
Yes.
Senna wanted now, and it wasn't that long after I think it changed. It wasn't immediate though. So, but it kind of gets woven up into a grand conspiracy, doesn't it? And I don't think it. I think there was just more general intransigence and not wanting to do what he wanted, because this was going on before they knew what happened in qualifying. So it wasn't specifically targeted at Senna, although clearly he felt it was absolutely targeted at him.
Well, he couldn't have conceived that anybody else was going to be on pole position, could he?
Well, that's very true. Yeah, if that certain worldview from Senna, I guess, would do that. Not unreasonably, in fact, given what he was doing. But yeah, I wouldn't be completely surprised if, rather than it just being part of that story, that it was just something really mundane, like they didn't want to mess about painting lines differently or changing. So it was probably some really mundane reason. They thought, well, we probably should, but actually it's just a bit awkward. So stop messing about. It could have been something so mundane that's been spun up into this thing over time. But there's no question it mattered to Senna, though. And that's kind of what's key in this story.
And it has kind of been proven right by time, in that we would never see the pole position be on the dirty side of the track now, unless you've got a weird track where the racing line moves across the track while they're on the grid, and it can be kind of hard to get it right. But it is something that's been standardized since, and it does kind of look weird now that you would put pole position over there. So I can see why. And obviously there were other races. I think the Senna movie has Senna, I think it's Hockenheim, asking for it to be moved.
Yeah.
I can't remember which year that is. It may have been 90 as well. So it was as a regular pole position sitter, I can see why this was something that bothered him, because he probably thought, as he said in the quote, you break your balls to get pole, then you're disadvantaged off the line. Some bloke that's slower than you beats you into turn one. Anyway, the tension on race day ratcheted up even further when Senna stormed out of the driver's briefing in protest against race officials closing off the escape road at the chicane after he'd been disqualified for using it in 1989 after colliding with Prost. Talking of the Senna movie, anyone who's seen that has seen this driver's briefing. But let's get to the real reason we're all here. Senna and Prost on the front row, the lights turned green, and as Senna expected, Prost took the lead from second on the grid on the clean side of the track. Prost moved across to cover any attempt from Senna to come back, but what he hadn't bargained for was what happened next. As Prost turned in, clearly ahead, Senna kept his foot down and rammed into the Ferrari's right rear corner, sending both cars into the tyre barrier on the outside of the track at high speed. Both were out of the race, meaning Senna was world champion. There are so many different quotes from different times from Senna and Prost about this accident. Before we start working through any of those, Ed, what did you think of this, just the incident itself? And were you surprised that, to borrow a phrase from Murray Walker, it happened immediately?
Well, I think the very fact that he had that phrase either pop into mind, or that it was already in his mind as a pre-prepared thing.
He
in
sort
case
of
there
says
was
it off the line as well, doesn't he, when Prost gets the better start. So he has two nibbles at it.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess nothing was a surprise when it came to this Senna Prost thing. But I think, looking at it kind of with a bit of distance, and even at the time, actually, it was a surprise Senna was prepared to do it where he was. Firstly, because, as people often say, there's the safety element, because it's high speed, so it's dangerous for Senna, dangerous for Prost. Could easily have sucked in a load of other cars as well. But also, just purely from a pragmatism point of view, it's not necessarily the highest probability place to do it, because there's every chance you'll trigger a red flag in this phase of it. So it wasn't super calculated. I think what Prost had done the year before was more calculated, because it was low speed. If you're going to deliberately have a collision, or invite a collision to happen, whatever phraseology you want to use, you kind of want to do it at a lower speed. But this was just sort of maximum Senna, wasn't it? Of entitled and just like, right, this is going to happen. So a surprise that it was such a chaotic scenario in which it happened. But I guess Senna thought that might have been his one and only chance. So yeah,
I'm
a
not sure
degree of
about that,
surprise.
Ed. There's no way he thought that Prost was going to run away. He was going to have another chance to do it. I think he just, it was there in front of him, so he took it.
Yeah, but there's references to the fact that it might be difficult to get close again, etc. So I think you're right. It was in mind that this could happen. So it's hard. It's hard to know how much premeditation there is in this sort of thing, isn't it? Certainly, he had in his mind he was happy for it to happen, but I think you've got to be when you've. It's difficult, isn't it? Because you kind of analyze it from the outside, and you think, well, that's not necessarily the safest and most sensible way to do it. But obviously, Senna was driven by very different things. Everyone's driven by different things. In his mind, there's the combination of the entitlement, the certainty that he was justified in doing that, which maybe just made him thought he was pretty much invulnerable in that situation. I mean, I think Prost suggested that he thought he was invulnerable in a racing car. Maybe that was part of it. But it's whatever it is, it's a fascinating glimpse of the psychology of Ayrton Senna, I would say. So perhaps all this stuff about whether it was the wise time to do it or the percentage play or safety, that's not the calculus that Senna's doing in his head, clearly. So you might well be right that it was just right, as soon as it can happen. If Prost gets away ahead, let's make it happen.
Two things there. I mean, you came up with very diplomatic ways of trying to describe the Prost incident from the year before. I mean, we're going to give Senna a very hard time over the next half an hour or so, but let's call a spade a spade. Prost took Senna out in 89. Senna returned the favour in much more dramatic circumstances in 90. I'm going to share a little story here. A photographer that we have all worked with once told me that the only photographer at turn one who had the right lens to get a sequence of them colliding was Senna's personal photographer. So all the other snappers kind of had longer lenses on to get the grid down from turn one, get them coming to turn one. The only guy who had the right lens to get them like into the gravel and colliding was Senna's. And that photographer never said anything, but there was a suspicion among the F1 photography pack at the time of like, why did that guy know which lens to have on? And there are some other things that we'll come to. So one of you mentioned, was it premeditated? I think we're about to explore how premeditated it might have been. But before we get to that, what did Senna say immediately afterwards? During the race, he was interviewed by none other than his own boss, Ron Dennis, for the F1 cameras. There's a bit of this in the F1 season review. I think the full version is on the F1 TV highlights of this race. Now, Ron Dennis and other McLaren insiders have spoken of Senna seeming awkward and conflicted when he got back to the pits after wiping Prost out. On camera here, Senna and Ron couldn't stop grinning. Nobody looks very conflicted during this interview. Senna said he wanted to claim the title by winning the race, as he had done at Suzuka in 1988, but unfortunately it went wrong in the first corner. He said he had nothing to lose, so he went for a gap on the inside, and Prost closed the door, and we ended up touching. He said it was too bad because he thought the race would have been exciting. He referenced Prost crashing into him at Suzuka the year before at the chicane, saying last year I lost in a similar manner, and this year it went wrong for him. And he said that when a title is on the line, you have to go for everything. And as happened in many other occasions in the past, there have been accidents in the first corner. He repeated again that there was a gap, that he was going faster than Prost, so he went for it. And when Prost closed the door, there was nothing I could do to avoid the contact. He added, if he had not closed the door, nothing would have happened and we would have continued racing. In later interviews that day, he blamed officials for not moving pole to the outside, saying the collision was what they wanted by refusing to change. And he said Prost took a chance when he couldn't afford to by turning into the corner when he knew I was going to come down the inside. Andy, that's the initial set of justification from Senna in the wake of the incident on the day. What do you make of that explanation?
Well, I'm going to invoke another piece of famous commentary, but this time from Murray's old partner, James Hunt, when talking about Rene Arnoux. And all I can say to that is bullshit.
I'm disappointed
It's a
that
professional foul, right? You can reason it all he likes. It's one of the worst pieces of sportsmanship I've ever seen. I mean, Ed talked about entitlement earlier, and it's completely entitled. It's petulant, it's petty, it's a horrendous, horrendous piece of driving. And the fact that he effectively got away with it, I think, is a bit of a stain on Formula One in general. To be honest with you, it's appalling, and no reason and rationale can justify what he did. Somebody could have been killed in that whole incident, and that just because he was annoyed that Pole was on the wrong side, or he was thought that the whole of the French setup was against him, does not justify his actions in any way, shape, or form.
There's a sort of bit of grudging respect in my mind for how blatant he could be in saying basically black is white in defending it. It reminds me a little bit of after, I'm sure one day we'll do Hockenheim 2010 with the famous team orders for Massa
Mm.
letting Alonso by, and they had the press conference room at that stage at Hockenheim was in the media centre, was in the front of the media centre, and Alonso throughout that whole press conference was just like denying completely, keeping it simple, just 100% of the party line. Massa couldn't do it so well, but Alonso did it so well, and Senna the same sort of thing. I mean, regardless of the ethics of the thing, there's sort of part of me that thinks, well, at least you've committed to it and you're willing to endlessly sit there and just say. I mean, this idea that if Prost doesn't turn into the corner, literally he doesn't go, he goes off. What does he have to do? Just back out, go wide, and let 3 or 4 cars pass? There's just no way for him not to take the corner. It's
And
so
let's not
It's
forget
not
they are not.
alongside him.
Yeah, they're
Yeah.
not side by side, are they? They're not contesting the corner. Prost is ahead.
exactly, and it's not like it's a huge braking zone or something. It's a
There's,
kink.
there isn't a gap. The gap he's aiming for is the side of Prost's car.
Yeah, exactly. So, hence the whole "if you no longer go for a gap" is a
That's the
nonsense.
single worst thing that's ever happened to motorsport. That is, it's justified every piece of shit driving that's followed.
Let's move on to Prost then, who was understandably furious. He said what Senna did was disgusting, and he pointed out that they were not contesting the corner side by side. Prost was clearly ahead. He said Senna was the opposite of honest, and he called Senna out for hypocrisy over being so upset about what Prost did to him a year earlier at the chicane. Alain said, according to him, I was completely in the wrong last year, and he would never have done something like that. So I was wrong and he was not. He can't have it both ways. Prost said he was not prepared to fight against irresponsible people who are not afraid to die, and that if driving like this was what was required to win championships from now on, okay, let him win, no problem. Prost also said that he didn't think Senna would go this far, saying, whatever he may think about me, I can't understand how he was prepared to risk his own safety going into the first corner. I never expected him to do this. I thought he was a member of the human race, that he was hard to race, but always fair. Ed, was that maybe a bit naive from Prost? Should he have expected, or at least suspected, that Senna might do something this drastic?
And maybe it's a case of kind of applying your own modes of thinking to somebody else, because obviously the 89 collision was very low speed, wasn't it? If you're going to have a collision, that's the place and the way to do it, because it's the one that's least likely to cause problems. In fact, it was such a sensible place to do it that it didn't actually cause a great deal of damage anyway.
Didn't take Senna out. No.
Exactly. Yeah. You've hit the wrong bit. That's perhaps what Martin Brundle was commentating. You might have said, but yeah. I mean, I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because I think Prost probably should have been aware that may have happened, and obviously Prost will know what happened past year. We can't, in the Prost Senna stuff, you can't paint Prost as completely innocent in everything, because what happened the previous year is part of this. But I don't really know what he could have done if he did expect it to happen. So I think even if it was in his mind, like I said, what could he do? Short of letting Senna pass, there wasn't much
Yeah.
he could do. So
But I tell you, how could he have let him pass from there, as you said earlier? But like, just run it out onto the
well,
marbles.
exactly, it would have been like he was being lapped, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
That's the only way he could have done it, and it would have probably cost him more than one place. So yeah, it's interesting. I guess perhaps that was the point when Prost realised just how far Senna was willing to go with his kind of righteous fury about the whole thing. So yeah, you can. I'm sure Prost probably knew something could happen, and I doubt it 100% surprised him. But clearly, he was taken aback by the safety implications. It's like, wow, you're willing to have that collision at that speed, and it is no exaggeration to say that you could have had serious injuries or worse from that accident, because you don't know where the cars are going. It could easily have pitched a car into a roll. Could easily have pitched. I mean, not just Prost, Senna. Senna could easily have had a horrendous outcome. He was probably the car that was in the. He was the car that was in the position to have the worst accident on its own, and Prost was probably the one who was in the position to to risk being collected if he was sort of turned around. But it's a chaotic thing. So I
They could
think
easily
Prost
have
just
ridden Senna could easily have ridden over the wheels then and been launched
yeah,
easily.
exactly,
And
exactly.
Suzuka's not exactly got a brilliant track record when it comes to that. In the past, some horrendous accidents there, not just involving drivers, but marshals and fans as well. I can see why that really did spook Prost.
Yeah, yeah. So he probably just thought, "Wow, this is what you're prepared to do." Maybe that's a moment of realization, but it's yeah, it's. I presume it's just something Prost never kind of managed, certainly for a long time, managed to really rationalise in his head. Well, you're willing to do that? Wow.
Yeah, it's a slightly unfair question from me. Unfair towards Prost, maybe, and unfair towards you, because we can look at it knowing that Senna was prepared to do that. We can go, well, of course we should have realised he was prepared to do that. But if you could put yourself to the Sunday morning or even 2 minutes before the start, I guess, would you have been thinking, you think they might collide, but would you have been thinking it would be that drastic? Easy to answer with hindsight. Now, Prost's view was if this kind of thing is acceptable now, racing is dead. He also called for changes to be made to the F1 regulations so that drivers could be sanctioned for doing something this bad, adding, if there are no changes in the regulations, it is not possible for me to continue. I have seen a slightly toned down version of that same quote somewhere else where he said may not be possible for him to continue. But either way, he was casting some doubt over his own future in F1 if a tougher stance wasn't taken on driving standards. Speaking in the book Senna versus Prost by Malcolm Foley, in an interview he gave to the author in 2008, Prost said, I almost stopped and retired that day. And he claimed that one of Senna's Honda engineers resigned over what Ayrton did. In that same interview, Prost added, Senna did not think about other people. He just thought about me. He was prepared to be in a crash and maybe kill himself or hurt himself. He was not afraid to kill himself. And he would it have been an overreaction from Prost if he had walked away from F1 over this?
No, I don't think so. I think there is a justification in that. If he was now in a position where because his main rival was going to be Senna for the foreseeable future, right? So they're locked into title battles, and whenever things get close or whenever Senna's upset, he's just literally going to ram into him. How can you race against that? If they're now the rules of engagement, admittedly potentially started by Prost, but escalated to an unreasonable degree, I think is fair to say, by Senna. Um, if you're not prepared to go toe to toe in that case, which means you're always going to have to back out, you're going to have to do, as Ed suggested, just move aside and let him through. Well, that's not racing, is it? So I can see how he may well have had that sort of dark night of the soul and um, gone through whether this was something a place he was prepared to go to in order to carry on. And I think he's absolutely right to call for the rules of engagement to be formalised to stop that sort of thing happening. As I said earlier on, there's not really any sanction for what Senna did here, none whatsoever. It's unbelievable. And yet here's the man who would tell you that the whole of the FIA was against him, or FISA was against him. Yeah, two sides to every story, aren't there?
That's a
Prost
good
maybe
point.
wished it, Prost maybe wished he did quit because then he could have avoided the 91 Ferrari.
Oh, well, that was
Could
my
have
final
wasted his
point then.
time.
You've missed that. So if he'd known how bad the 643 was going to be, he probably would have quit.
Maybe he could have got in that Williams sooner.
Yeah.
Now, we've mentioned that the FIA is supposed to be against Senna there. Obviously, at this point, it's headed up by Senna's nemesis or the villain of the Senna story, Jean-Marie Balestre, who featured, let's not forget, very heavily around all the Suzuka 89 controversy. Now, he was not present in 1990, but he was interviewed on French TV, calling what Senna did a very, very dirty move. He called it a scandal that the World Championship should be decided on such a collision and said it was an appalling end. He made a few references. He kept going back to the public being able to judge who was at fault, saying the whole world was witness and judge, and I leave everybody to be their own judge of who was to blame. And then he said there can be only one verdict. So he was then asked if Senna would face sanction for what he did, at which point he said, I am FISA president, not a judge. And he said that Senna's disqualification from the 1989 race was a decision taken by the stewards, and as I mentioned earlier, was based on Senna cutting the chicane, which is obviously a specific rule that he was deemed to have broken. But Balestra said this time there were no elements to allow for Senna's disqualification. He felt that Senna deserved the title over the course of the season, but he said, I regret that he did not win it in style. Ed, Andy's already got a bit angry about the fact that no action was taken here. Should the governing body have found a way to punish him for this?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because there's a couple of factors. One is just the general tendency. It was normally the most extreme incidents that got any kind of punishment. So in that regard, this is probably extreme enough to warrant
You think,
consideration.
yeah.
Obviously, when you're talking about finding ways to punish, there's kind of two things as well, because you can take actions against someone, you can give them a ban, you can do whatever, but it might be one of those scenarios where there's not actually anything that can do to change a championship situation. That's kind of been lost, hasn't it? Because you can't exclude a driver from the race because they were in a gravel trap with a pile of bits. So there was nothing to change in that regard. But it's a really interesting question because they tended to have very light touch approaches. But I think it tells you how out of the ordinary basically deliberately causing this kind of shunt is, because it was almost self-policing before because of the high risk involved in it. You know, you could do that today and it would still, there'd be an element of risk, but you'd be pretty unlucky for things to go really badly wrong because the cars are so safe. That's not the case then. So I think it's almost, they're not equipped to deal with this kind of thing because they just expect people to be sensible because literally their lives are on the line. So I wonder if at the very least, something could have been done to put a line in the sand, kind of a bit like they did with Jerez 97. Because Jerez 97 wasn't about punishing Schumacher. Really, it was about creating a precedent, wasn't it? So if you got the next year, let's say the same accident happens, but the driver who causes it wins the championship, you've got to say, right, you lose your points. You've lost a championship. That's a big part of what Jerez 97 was about.
But
And
that was
maybe,
easier to do because you were throwing out the guy who it had failed. He'd come off work. You know, Schumacher was runner-up in the championship, so you can throw him out. It's one of those big questions we always get, isn't it? Would they have thrown him out if he'd been the champion? Would you be willing to change the champion over something like this, which, as you're outlining here, clearly they weren't willing to do in 90?
yeah. Well, I think I don't want to talk about Jerez too much. I think the fact that they
We
did
can.
do that penalty was kind of for future reference, and they could say, well, actually, no, this is the precedent we've established, so it's easier to do. Whereas, it's so charged though because Senna's laid out his stall to defend it. Senna's capable of flouncing off, isn't he, and just walking away from Formula One. He's the biggest star ultimately. You know, Prost's star's waned a little bit at this point. Although he's kind of got equal top billing, Senna is kind of the main man in Formula One at this point. So Senna has shown he's willing to defy it. So it's strange. I mean, but Velez just seems to be kind of saying, well, the court of public opinion knows what happened. It's like, well, that's not really of much use,
Yeah,
is
they
it?
can't do
So,
anything.
yeah. I mean, there's lots of stuff with Prost talking about at length about what it means for racing. And it is a concern because if that becomes part of your armory, then it does mean racing doesn't work very well. And we've had this problem flare up a lot over the years as well. And it's actually, I'd say that this is the point where this problem's starting to grow, one that's grown into a huge one these days, that drivers are willing to do this. So I think it would have been good if they'd found something. I don't think there's any legitimate way to have reopened the championship or anything or change that. So you would say that in terms of whether justice would be served by that, not sure. But I'd have liked them to have found a line in the sand way to do it that would have just sort of say, look, if this happens again, yeah, that can't happen. But it's clear ultimately only drivers were going to do that in the most extreme circumstances, and only the most extreme drivers. Senna might. In fact, I'd say Senna probably was the only one willing to do that. So it's a unique set of circumstances, and maybe they should have flicked through the general regulations and found a way to do it. And I think perhaps the later regime would have found a way to use a catch-all regulation, because there's stuff there even then about general driving standards, etc. And you can always pull something out to do something. So they should have looked a bit harder if they wanted to really take action.
There's no way a Max Mosley run FIA allows this to go unpunished.
Yeah.
No way.
And Mosley was brilliant at A, finding those little general things, and B, putting them in deliberately into the regulations in order to do what you want, if you like. So I'm sure that'd have been a way.
Yeah, Max's thing was always the more vague I can make the rules, the more ways I can use them to my benefit. So yeah, there'd have been some vague rule about driver conduct or something. He'd have found a way to do something about this. Now, like Prost, Ferrari owner Fiat also threatened to quit F1 if changes were not made, as it said it did not want to be part of a world without rules. Senna laughed that off, criticising Prost for pushing Fiat and Ferrari into making amazing statements. Senna said he would welcome any rule changes, and he had nothing negative to say about FISA announcing a special inquiry into what it felt was a general increase in collisions in F1, which was harming the image of the championship. Senna felt the timing of that was coincidental, and that it was a result of F1 having a greater intensity of competition in 1990 than it had had in 88 and 89, when McLaren were more dominant. He said it was about a lot of drivers in a lot of races, and it is not directed at me. It just happened that this was announced shortly after Japan. Andy, do you think it was coincidental? Was contact between cars becoming more of a problem by 1990 in general?
No, it's directed at him. It's directed at him and Prost. Um, the, I watched the whole of the race. There's not a collision between two other cars anywhere else in the race. Just those two. In fact, there's not a great deal of racing, which is why we spent about 90% of this show talking about this incident. No, it's very much to do with, as you said earlier, by far and away the two biggest superstars having redefined what appeared to be the rules of racing for the worse. And as we've already discussed, there seemed to be a need to have to legislate against this because they were seemingly unable to sort out among themselves. But I certainly don't perceive there having been a particular increase in on-track collisions between drivers over that sort of late 80s, early 90s period. That was to follow when Schumacher came in and took what Senna did to the next level. This was the beginning of that downward slope, and as Ed mentioned earlier on, and why we need seemingly to redefine the rules of racing every 5 minutes now. Up until then, it seemed that they were implicit, they were understood. There was a code of conduct that drivers adhered to, came from all the way through their junior Formula up until into F1, and that was just the way it was. It's from here onwards that we started to have to officiate against the way they started to behave to one another.
Yeah, I remember on one of the few but brilliant occasions I've had to do interviews with Jacques Villeneuve, we somehow talked about his views on racing standards and that. And he said that back in his day, and I remember getting Damon Hill to back this up as well, he said the guys who used their car as a weapon or crashed a lot never made it to F1 because they probably hurt themselves or ran out of money from all the damage and this sort of thing. So you ended up with like the sensible guys usually were the ones who made it all the way to the top. Whereas now, yeah, the rules have been redefined by several leading lights of F1 since Senna's time, but almost lost in all this was the fact that Senna had claimed that second world championship we mentioned earlier. However, Prost felt he and Ferrari were the deserving champions. At the time in 1990, he said that he felt he won the title from a technical viewpoint and that losing it in this way was disgusting. He said in 2008 that we should have been world champions, and he believed that would have changed a lot of things, which I presume he means for his position and relationship with Ferrari. Senna was dismissive of this, as you might expect. He was quoted in Autocourse at the end of the year saying, "I think Prost does a good job focusing people's attention on the things he wants them to focus on. His complaints in Japan were designed to ignore the other races in which we beat him." Ed, simple question. Who was the more deserving champion in 1990?
I'm going to give a typically complex answer.
Of course you are. I should have given this to Andy.
I actually think, I mean, if you look at the general response at the time, like the Autocourse top tens, various top tens people did, most of them put Prost number one, and part of that is what happened, I think, at Suzuka. But I tend to try and kind of take that out of that and try and look at performance. But actually, Prost Senna's quite even that year if you look at in terms of who would be the deserving champion. I think it's almost a coin toss between the two of them, and I think that's probably why the what Senna did at Suzuka meant people leant more towards Prost, perhaps in that regard. So, yeah, it's. I think it's one of you have some years where genuinely both drivers are kind of worthy enough champions, and even if we might think one was marginally, I think 2021 is another case of that, which I know is a risky year to mention. But you had Hamilton and Verstappen. It wouldn't have been wrong for either driver to win that championship ultimately, because they both were operating at a very, very high level, regardless of how it ended. And I think 1990 similar. So I've kind of hedged a little bit there. There's a little bit of a part of me that just really likes the idea of Prost winning it, going to Ferrari. He drove some great races in 1990. Arguably, it's his best season. So I might just slightly weight it towards Prost, but not for the reasons that many did at the time. In terms of, I'm not. It's not that I'm allowing what Senna did at Suzuka, but that's just sort of one part of the whole thing. And if you look at performance, I think maybe you can. So maybe I'll go 55-45 in Prost's favour. So that's a very, very long and convoluted way for me to answer just Prost. But I just don't feel that strongly about it, if you see what I mean. In that it's so even because it's two great drivers in different teams. In a way, apart from the way it ends, it's the perfect championship battle. Although you can also say, it's so important to the storylines of F1, etc. Was it a bad thing Suzuka 90 happened, especially as no one was injured? Well, probably not, because there's all this stuff with Roberto talking about how shameful it was, etc. But it's a talking point decades on, and it'll continue to be a talking point forever. So sometimes things that ostensibly are bad in F1 are actually very, very good for it, and I think Suzuka 90 is one of them. So yeah, I've digressed massively. So I've gone with a gentle, fractionally more deserving Prost, but I don't have a problem with the fact that Senna won the championship, and actually I don't think he necessarily needed this to happen to have won it.
I think Suzuka 90 is a great lost race. I think had they made it round that first corner with Prost ahead, we would have had a fantastic battle. And if Senna had prevailed, I would say, yeah, he deserved the title. And if Prost had held him off, I think it's his second best championship. I think he's better in '86, but still,
Very
he's
true.
on top for most of '90. Yeah, he's very good.
Yeah, and I think we all love a season where you have that head to head between two drivers in two different teams as well. I mean, you mentioned 2021. We've combined Suzuka 90 Senna Prost with a mention of Hamilton Verstappen 2021. So the online F1 universe might explode at the release of this podcast. So let's give ourselves a breather and focus on the race, or lack thereof, as Andy has said, that
This
carried
won't take
on.
long.
No, when the huge cloud of dust at turn one had started to settle. Senna's teammate Gerhard Berger, who said years later Senna had told him before the race he was going to have a good show in the first corner. Berger assumed the lead, but at the start of lap 2, he was out, spinning at the first corner. Berger said he spun on oil and dirt that was down on the track from the Senna-Prost collision, but he said there were no slippery surface flags out. He'd been considering backing off in case the track was dirty, given what had happened a lap before, but he decided the track would be clean because the whole field had driven through it once already. He said he was too angry to even go back to the McLaren pit afterwards, as he desperately needed a win in his first season at McLaren, and this race was on a plate for him with Senna and Prost out. Given all of that, Andy, was it just foolish of Berger to not tread a little bit carefully, at least on lap 2?
It's insane, right? He drives through a cloud of rubble and debris in order to assume the lead. So it wasn't as if he wasn't aware there was all sorts of stuff out there, bits of carbon fibre, all sorts of things that could have damaged it. He's got a decent lead over Mansell. He can afford to go through there at 75, 80% or whatnot. What the hell's he doing? And this race was, as he said, on the plate. It was there for the taking. But to me, it just summed up his entire McLaren stint, really. Just a case of what should have been and ultimately wasn't. Unfortunately, it's not really reasonable footage of him, but you just sort of see him sort of with his back wheels in the gravel. I'd like to have seen exactly what had happened to him, because he's clearly just come in too quick, hasn't he? He's come in a bit hot. It's a bit slippery, and he's lost the back end.
Also, it's Suzuka. It's not that easy to overtake. You're not under huge pressure. You can afford to kind of 80% it into there, tiptoe through,
Absolutely.
and you're not going to suddenly get overtaken in the S's as well. But anyway, Berger being out left Nigel Mansell's Ferrari in the lead. And after taking it easy in the early laps, with a bit of a queue forming behind him, he gradually settled in and started to pull away from the chasing pack, which by this point was led by the Benettons of Nelson Piquet and Roberto Moreno. By the time Mansell pitted to change tyres, he had a 7-second lead, but the 3 cars directly behind him, the 2 Benettons and Riccardo Patrese Williams, were all trying to get through the race without making a stop, and all were within range to at least be ahead of Mansell when he rejoined from the pits. But we never got to see how that played out, because as Mansell pulled away with the Ferrari V12 screaming its head off, he lost all drive, coasting to a halt at the end of the pit lane and banging the steering wheel as he'd snapped a drive shaft, leaving the pits. Ed, might it have been in Nigel's interest to leave the pits a bit more carefully here?
I don't think Nigel Mansell did anything carefully or cautiously in Formula One. That's not the brand, is it? So I just don't. I mean, probably, yeah, it would have been in his interest to, but he then wouldn't have been Nigel Mansell, would he? So that's just you take the good and the bad, don't you? There's a lot of good in Mansell, but that bad element you've just got to take out. He was quite hard on machinery at times, not always, because if you were completely careless, then you'd have probably retired a lot more times than he did. But yeah, he's just that kind of driver, isn't he?
With Mansell out, the second half of the race became a cruise for the non-stopping Benettons of Piquet and Moreno, who took a comfortable 1-2 finish. This was Piquet's first win in 3 years, and he readily admitted it was lucky. He said there was no way the Benettons could have kept up with the McLarens and the Ferraris, and even if he could have raced a bit with Mansell after Nigel's pit stop, he felt it would have been difficult to keep him behind, given the Ford V8 in the Benetton was down on power compared to the top engines. He said his harder tyres had lasted the race well and had plenty of life left in them by the end, so he could have gone quicker if he needed to. Andy, I mentioned there 3 years since Piquet has won a race. How significant was it for him to get back to winning ways after the barren years?
Well, it was significant for me. Was beginning to think I'd never see him win a race again. So that was good. I mean, ultimately, I don't think that at any point anyone was thinking he was going to get a top drive again. Now he showed that given the opportunity, he could deliver it. But as you said, it was lucky. What we would have been fourth or fifth or whatever. It was a steady drive, right? He just drove around at a relatively good pace, not under any pressure at any point. But it's obviously good for his bank balance, given the deal that he'd done on a pay for points. So I'm sure he was absolutely delighted with that.
This, as you say there, won't go down as a vintage PK win, but second place for Benetton stand-in Moreno was huge, and he was in floods of tears when he got out of the car in Parc Ferme to be embraced by his fellow Brazilian. It was the end of a roller coaster weekend that had started with Moreno braking where he would have in a EuroBrun, then realizing the Benetton was so much better that he was having to re-accelerate and then brake again for some of the corners. Then by the end of Friday, he said he was destroyed physically because, as we mentioned earlier, he'd barely been racing or driving all year. And on Saturday, he was genuinely having to manage how many laps he did, so he wasn't sure how he was going to get through the race. He said he tried for a while to keep up with Piquet, but he couldn't manage it physically, so he decided to let him go. For the final 25 laps, he was so tired, he was having to concentrate on breathing first and driving the car second. But when he nearly went off at Spoon Curve, it woke him up and he got a second wind. In an interview about this weekend with our very own Sam Smith for the race website a few years ago, Moreno said, "On the podium, I felt so happy. After all the bad cars I'd had and the amazing circumstances of the week leading up to that point, I just looked around at Nelson and thought, this is what happiness is." Ed, was Moreno finishing second actually a bigger deal than Piquet winning the race?
It almost was for me, because obviously it's Roberto Moreno who's anyone who jumps out of a terrible car into a good car and immediately gets a result is a great story. But it's funny, it's so much part of the PK win story, because obviously Moreno was a long-time friend of PK. There's sort of photos of, like, Moreno's this little scrawny kid who's there with PK in Brazil and that kind of thing. So it's a lovely story from that perspective as well as it just being a great story from Moreno. So I kind of see the fact that Moreno's second to his teammate PK that those things are inseparable from just Moreno being on the podium himself. But it's a fantastic story for a driver who was, an amazingly tenacious driver who was always up against it in his career. Did well to make it to Formula One in the first place, let alone have as long an F1 career as he did. So, for me, it's a bigger deal. Although obviously Benetton's the second billing on the podium, but I'm sure we'll talk about that later. But yeah, I'm just pleased that Moreno did have that one glorious moment in Formula One in the perfect possible way, dropping in at the last minute alongside his great mate. And yeah, obviously a Benetton win's always a reason for celebration in this period, isn't it? Because they were quite rare. So yeah, it's a really special story in this race, I think, Moreno.
Yeah, it's a great fairy tale, and we love that. Maybe Andy probably preferred the PK win to the Moreno second, but as you
Oh,
say, if you
I
go
don't
on,
know. I'm a romantic at heart. I thought it was just a brilliant story.
yeah, and as Ed says, you can package it all up together. Really, I think it does always get remembered as kind of the 1-2 rather than one or the other. But if it wasn't fairy tale enough with first and second, the podium finishes were completed by another feel-good story as home hero Aguri Suzuki came home third for La Rousse. This made Suzuki the first Japanese driver to score an F1 podium, and where better to do it than on home ground. And I would say this wasn't a total fluke. He qualified ninth, and after the early shenanigans, he was running seventh. That became sixth when he passed Derek Warwick's Lotus on lap 7. He was up to fifth when Thierry Boutsen pitted on lap 21. Suzuki pitted on lap 26 and rejoined ahead of the struggling Boutsen. And then Mansell's retirement promoted him to fourth. Then, when Riccardo Patrese bid to go the whole race without stopping failed, Suzuki jumped him and then just kept him at more than 10 seconds at bay for the rest of the race to claim this incredible podium. Speaking to David Tremaine for the F1 website in 2018, Suzuki called this the best moment of his career. And he said he was happy to give something to the Japanese fans, given it was hard back then to connect with them when he was in Europe. And there was even more delight for those Japanese fans because Satoru Nakajima picked up a point in sixth for Tyrrell. So a great day for Japan. Andy, I'm going to make Ed wait to talk about Larousse here. I said there that I don't think this result was a fluke. Is that fair?
Absolutely. It's a great drive. I would say easily the best of his career. As you say, he had to make up positions. He was fast throughout. There's no way he should have finished ahead of both Williams on effectively the same strategy. Really, really class act. Going back to the podium, having watched the whole race again, there's a great bit where the national anthem start and Piquet elbows Moreno in the ribs to take his cap off. Just 'cause
I
it's
always
obviously
like that when you see
yeah.
someone who doesn't know the etiquette.
Yeah, exactly. But Suzuki's great on that. He's clearly incredibly emotional, but he's sort of wrestling to keep it all together, and you could just feel the pride emanating from him. And I think everyone deserves their day of days, and that was absolutely his. And while, of course, there's an element of fortune with the front row taking themselves out, there was nothing lucky about the rest of his performance.
He's an interesting driver, Suzuki, because there are times when he looks completely out of his depth in F1. And there's times when he looks really, really good. And this is one of those really, really good days. And it's the kind of driver you don't get these days that are all over the map. And that it's a bit of a shame in a way. But, you know, he was a very, very good driver. And that Lola as well, the Lola chassis was a really, really good car as well. Very, very well conceived Chris Murphy car. So it's nice for Larousse to have a day of days. Obviously, it's a fun team. They always struggle in Formula One, but just one of those. It's great when these moments come together and you have something. And having been in Japan when there's been a Japanese driver on the podium, it's fantastic because the fans there are, you know, everything you've heard about Japanese Formula One fans is right, but multiplied because they are so enthusiastic, so well prepared. They put so much effort when they're at the track into being there and all the stuff they do that it's wonderful to have something like that happen. And obviously doubly significant given that this was not something that had happened before.
We mentioned there then that Suzuki, beat the Williamses fair and square. So let's have a quick word about them because really, in a race with no McLarens or Ferraris, you've got to wonder how did Williams only finish fourth and fifth, 36 and 46 seconds down on Piquet by the end. Both Patrese and Boutsen complained after the race of severe understeer, which was destroying their front tyres. Boutsen said he had to drive conservatively to make it to the end after pitting on lap 20, and Patrese said his plan to copy the Benetton strategy and not make a stop was undone when his front tyres were gone with 20 laps to go. He said the car felt good for 5 or 6 laps after that stop, but then the understeer came back, so there really was nothing he could do to get back at Suzuki. Ed, is this a massive missed opportunity for Williams?
Yeah, profoundly so, because the pattern of the season up to that point was that if McLaren and Ferrari didn't win, Williams won.
Exactly.
So they should have been in the right place to win it. It shows a certain flat-footedness because obviously they'd wanted to do that strategy. And you've kind of got to blame the drivers in this scenario, haven't you? That they needed to force a pit stop. That's clearly what needed to happen, but didn't happen. And I guess the pit wall could have looked at the pace and maybe wondered about it as well. But yeah, just flat-footed across the board. And obviously, flat-footed strategy from Williams is a regular theme in the sort of first half of the Bring Back V10s era, isn't it? So perhaps that's appropriate, but it's a missed opportunity. Roebuck, I think, described the race as effectively it became a non-championship race because the kind of principal characters
it
are
felt
out.
a bit like that, didn't it?
Yeah, which is great. And in a way, it's great that Williams didn't win, because if Williams would have won, that would have been normal and it would have been far less fun. But Benetton winning, Piquet winning, Renault on the podium, Suzuki on the podium is all great. So we should actually be thanking Williams for missing this particular opportunity, because it would have been much more boring and wouldn't have made much difference to them in the long term. Whereas it did make a lot of difference to the top three in that race.
That's a great way of doing it. Looking at it, I love that. Let's come back then before we finish to the big story of Suzuka 90. We'll save Senna's interview / argument, call it what you like, with Jackie Stewart for whenever we do Australia 1990, because that's where that took place. But we're going to skip forward a year to Suzuka 91, where Senna wrapped up his third championship, again in Japan. He had a little nibble at this in the TV part of that post-race press conference, which you can find on YouTube, but then he really let loose in the main press conference. I'm going to read it word for word as it is presented in the Senna versus Prost book by Malcolm Foley. So here goes. Senna said, "Before you ask me, 1989 was a disgraceful year here. I still today struggle to cope with that when I think about it. You all know what took place. I won the race and I was robbed of it. And that was not justice. What took place over that winter was really shit. Then 1990 was, to prove a point, to show everyone that what you do here, you pay. When we came to Suzuka, I was in the lead of the championship. Before practice, myself and Gerhard went to the officials to change the pole position because it was in the wrong place. They said yes, no problem. I got pole, and then what happened? Balestra gave an order to the officials, and the officials said, oh, no, we don't change the pole position. And we said, but we agreed before that it should be on the left. It was an order from Balestra, and I know that from inside the system. I said to myself, okay, you try to work clean, to do your job properly, and you get screwed by stupid people. If at the start, because I'm in the wrong place, Prost beats me off the line, at the first corner, I'm going for it, and he better not turn in ahead of me because he's not going to make it. And it just happened like this. He took a chance and it didn't work because I went for it. I didn't care if we crashed. I went for it and we crashed. That was the result of what happened in 1989. It was unavoidable. Why did I cause the accident? Because if you get fucked by the system every single time you try to do your job cleanly and properly, what should you do? It was the result of a bad decision influenced by Balestra. It was not my responsibility. I contributed to it, yes, but it was not my responsibility." Andy, this is absolutely explosive. It's the confession we didn't get in 1990. What did you think when you saw all of this coming back from the reports in Japan?
I mean, to me, it tarnishes his legend. I think it's, as I think Ed said it way back, the entitlement here is off the charts. I think it shows a complete lack of accountability, and it's the fundamental flaw in his psyche. The man was absolutely a genius, quite possibly the best or fastest Formula One driver there's ever been. Um, but this inability to disassociate himself from the situation in a dispassionate way and look at the situation for what it is, and his role in it, um, means I can never fully get on board with being behind it. Right? It's there's no contrition here, right? All there is a series of, I would say, half-assed justifications for doing something that was completely irresponsible. And I think it absolutely diminishes his overall standing in the pantheon of Formula One greats.
It's very interesting, isn't it, when you talk about the legend of Senna? Because you said it tarnished his legend, but and while I see what you mean there, also from another perspective, it's absolutely integral to the legend, isn't it? Because
Yes.
it tells you what Senna is, and to be a top Formula One driver, you've not only got to be extraordinarily good in terms of your skill sets, but you've got to be quite an extreme character. You've got to be ruthless. So you get these people who are just sort of sort of on the edges of the bell curve in terms of their mindset and their mentality. And the majority of the champions are extremes in some way, shape, or form, and Senna's one of them. So yes, on the one hand, the fact he was willing to do this, and the fact that he felt so confident that it was correct, and also just told the world, clearly thinking they'd all 100% agree with him and think it was all right for him to say it was not my responsibility, is fascinating. And it probably tells you about how he rationalized it a little bit, because it's no longer him in the car deciding to cause a very dangerous crash. It's, yes, he's decided to do it, but he had to do it, didn't he? Of course I had to do that. Everybody made me. It's like, well, not really, is it? But it's part of the legacy of the extremes with Senna, isn't it? And I guess that's the legend, isn't it? That, the people who completely 100% buy into the deification of Senna, and that is what happens in some parts,
Oh, absolutely.
will think, yeah, he's quite right, 100% completely, because it almost gets cultish in something. And if people want to buy into that, that's fine. That's part of what sort of fandom is. But it also does, if you're sort of stepping back from it, you're saying, well, that's a pretty dangerous mindset to get yourself into. I don't want to extrapolate from that to whatever else happened, but it tells you a lot about the mentality of this driver. But you don't get Senna the driver without this downside. I don't think it's like with all of us. Nobody is 100% right, 100% good, are they? We're all a mixed bag, a complex psychology. So I think we're actually quite fortunate that he was willing to say this so soon, because obviously, tragically, with Senna, we don't have the luxury of him 20 years later looking back on it and telling the whole
Indeed.
story. But because he felt so entitled, because he felt so right, because he was, of course, justified, he was willing just to stand there and just say, or sit there rather, and say, no, well, this happened, this happened, this happened. They all made me do it, and that's why it happened, and it's not really my responsibility, even though I'll take a tiny bit of blame. It's extraordinary, really. Really extraordinary.
The the thing that amazes me, I think, is that he's still so wound up about it a year later. Prost is Prost hasn't quite been fired at the point he gives these quotes, but Prost is kind of a non-entity in Senna's world by this point. I had a little spat at Hockenheim in '91, and it is the fact that even in a moment of joy and celebration, he's just become a 3-time world champion. He doesn't sit down and go, you know what? I did this. These are the reasons. Let's move on from it. Instead, it's like, no, I want to go and I want to moan about this again a year later from a position of strength because I've just won another championship. And here's why all these people are wrong. And I'm even more right than I said I was a year earlier.
It's very human as well, isn't it? In a way, you can understand it.
Well, it
These
is
are
if you're dealing with a 6-year-old. Yeah, it's not if you're dealing with an adult.
well, F1 drivers as a breed, I would say they are not necessarily the most standard set of people in terms of their psychology and their outlooks.
I'm
Let's
not
put
going
it
to
that
argue
way.
with that.
It's a really strange environment to operate in, doubly so when you're at the absolute top and you're somebody like. So I'm not trying to sort of justify it. For me, it's not really about justify or condemn. It's just trying to understand it. That's where the fascination lies for me. And that's why I just find it so interesting that he would say this, because I'm convinced when he was saying that, he thought nobody listening would have any problem with it. He thought, well, yeah, all I'm sitting here and I'm saying up is up and down is down. Of course, everyone's going to agree with me. I was completely right. And that tells you so much about what made Senna great, what made Senna not so great, what made his legend, what tarnished his legend. So in those few paragraphs, you learn so much about Ayrton Senna. And yeah, it's great that he couldn't let it go and that he was still going on about it, because then we really do actually understand what he was thinking, what he was doing, in a way that we probably, for most normal drivers, wouldn't learn until decades later.
And that is the most fascinating bit about Senna, though, is the way that he opens up in this way. And we ran that interview, 40-odd-minute interview on the on the YouTube channel, where he gives such brilliantly revealing answers. I don't know whether that's just a product of the time that he was in, where there was just less media, so people were given to give them more interest in detailed answers. If you watch talk shows of those eras, you'll get much more revealing answers from celebrities rather than pre-rehearsed, semi-made up stories,
Yeah.
skits that are there to elicit a laugh rather than give you any insight into their character. There's no one like that now. There's no one that has half the amount. I was going to say self-awareness, but there's no awareness. But that sort of, as you said, Ed, just the full-on belief that whatever he says is right. And things are the poorer for that, right? We don't get that level of interest in discourse now.
And can you imagine if this incident happened today, if Suzuka 90 happened today in the social media world? I mean, it would have been apocalyptic, wouldn't it? You know, the stuff we've just said here, you'd have all the Senna fans condemning you for saying it tarnished his legend. I'd have everybody hating me
I probably
for
have death threats.
yeah, exactly. Well, and that does happen. And, you know,
Yeah.
anybody, you know, I've had that sort of thing. I'm not particularly worried about, but that's what happens in the social media. But it would have just exploded, wouldn't it? It absolutely exploded, and everybody would be attacking everyone. And
I don't think social media could have handled this.
no.
It might
And actually,
legitimately break the internet.
yeah. And actually, if you look at it, this is the closest to a social media storm there is, sort of before social media in F1, because it's talked about a lot over a very long period of time. So it's a huge deal. And as I alluded to earlier, it's a huge part of the legend of Formula One, I would say, as well. This is a point where Formula One's growing and growing and growing. And we can't pretend that the world works in a way that everyone wants everything clear cut and perfect. They want these sorts of stories of stories of villainy or heroism, depending on what your perspective is. So
It's good
this
for
was
us. It's good for this
was
podcast.
it's good for this podcast. It's good for Formula One. That doesn't mean you want those sorts of dangerous accidents to happen or whatever, but you cannot say it as some said at the time, the sort of the Roebuck perspective, which I understand because it's rooted in an old school what's right, etc. But this is a huge story, and it's a huge story that people are still responding to today. We'll get lots of responses, etc., to this, and probably get some quite impassioned responses as well, and that's great in a way. So I think it's, strange as it might be to say, it's good this happened, but just thankfully the accident didn't go as it could have done, because it would be a very different storyline if the worst had happened in that accident, which it very well could have done. And that's just the bit in this whole thing that just makes me a little bit uncomfortable, that it was, you could say what happened in 89 was more surgical from Prost's perspective, but 1990 from Senna's perspective was, to say bulldozer would be generous.
It was a napalm strike, wasn't it?
Exactly, with all of the precision and potential bystanding destruction that entails. So I mean, what a story, and the fact that it's still so important today tells you a lot.
Yeah, I do try and be self-aware of this sort of thing. It's very easy for us to look back on a controversy from a long time ago, criticize some of the protagonists involved, but ultimately, I think you mentioned it earlier as well, Ed. We are grateful that these things have happened and that people still want to hear about them and talk about them, and that we've got so much interesting material. You know, if Ayrton Senna had been the kind of character to shut down when he thought he was guilty of something, we'd be sort of scratching at the surface of what he said and relying purely on people around him and Prost's view. Instead, the person who's spoken about Suzuka 90 the most in the year or two that followed was Ayrton Senna, which is very handy. You don't get that very often. So it'd be hypocritical of us to be to act too righteous about it. But yeah, we are able to do that because the consequences weren't as bad as they could have been. So let's leave it there for Suzuka 90. If you're a newer listener with us, make sure you go back into our archive. In season 9, you can find Suzuka 89 to remind yourself of everything that happened in the previous chapter of this epic story. We've also covered Imola 89 back in season 4, which is often considered the start of the Senna-Prost war, and our France 89 episode in season 3 has a decent chunk on the rivalry, as that's when Prost announced he was leaving McLaren and detailed some of the reasons why. As for season 12, next time we're off to the end of the 1990s and the 1999 German Grand Prix, where Eddie Irvine got to enjoy the benefits of Ferrari team orders for once, as his unlikely title charge against Mika Hakkinen really started to come together.